Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Those of you that are enjoying breakfast, please feel free to come and join us in the audience. It feels very lonely up here right now, and we'll get going on some content reasonably soon. But my name is Jeff Tuff. I'm joined here by three great panelists. I'll be trying to moderate them, but they really don't need much moderation. We've got Chris from Princeton, Kate, a colleague of mine from Deloitte, and Lori from State Street. And the topic we'd like to dig into today is actually taking a more systemic view of some of the challenges that we face in the energy transition and how we put to use a lot of the climate tech that we've been talking about over the past few days. A lot of the research that Chris and Kate have been doing in their respective organizations have to do with how to affect systemic change. And Lori, as you'll hear, has been thinking a lot about the financing aspect of that. So we're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about Chris and Kate's research. We absolutely want to open this up to audience participation and questions. We have a mic somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where it is, but hopefully the room will gradually fill up and people will be engaged, and we'll get to hear from you as well. But we're going to start with Chris, who is going to talk about some of the work he's been doing on the path to net zero with Princeton. So Chris, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Great to be here. So I'm going to lean pretty heavily on a study I co-led at Princeton between 2019 and 2021 called Net Zero America, because it actually helped frame the scale and speed of this challenge. And I think one of our lessons was we can get to net zero by multiple pathways with existing technologies. So this is kind of giving us a sense that we don't necessarily need any new technologies to get there. But one of the takeaways from this was that the pathways are extremely capital intensive. So if you look here, this is a middle of the road pathway. It's not all renewables or all CCS or all nuclear. And you can see we're talking about 3 terawatts of wind and solar, a 3-fold expansion of transmission, terawatts of batteries, hundreds of millions of tons, or 50 to 100 million tons of clean hydrogen. And at the same time, we're talking about a CCS enterprises that it's 1 billion tons a year being transported around the country and injected into the subsurface. So you look at these and you realise this is really quite a remarkable undertaking. And I think the other message is, while we have the technologies to get there, it is really unprecedented, this amount of greenfield infrastructure that we have to build across all sectors. We in the US or anywhere in the world today, perhaps with the exception of China, have really not had an experience building infrastructure at this speed and scale in human history. The second challenge we have is to make that infrastructure happen is the enormous risk capital mobilisation. So pathways to net zero are typically 3 to 5 times more capital intensive on the supply side, so think about clean energy and industrial decarbonisation infrastructure, than the traditional energy and industrial systems we've become used to. And so that means for the US, for example, we're going to need to mobilise in the order of 9 to 15 trillion US dollars of hard infrastructure capital between now and 2050. And so, you know, the models we used, they imagine that we make these decisions and we build assets instantaneously. There are no waiting for transmission or waiting for permits to be issued. And so there's a whole range of chicken or egg challenges that we see emerge that actually create investment hesitancy, which is actually slowing the amount of capital being deployed. The second thing, or the second two things about the existing technology pathways are, we need to build a durable consent with communities. We're losing that, right? We're losing it in renewables. We've almost lost it in CCS. We need better models of engaging and sharing benefits with communities. And then the final thing is workforce mobilisation. The energy workforce of the future has for the rest of this century, has 3 to 4 times more workforce than the current energy systems. And so whilst we can get there with existing technologies, there are, you know, perhaps really quite incredible challenges to overcome. So I think of the role of climate tech as really about addressing speed. And I think there are three things that would be really helpful. Information transfer to help coordinate the scale and speed of things we're talking. More integration and visibility across sectors, so data science can be really helpful here, and intensification of solutions. So we need to be able to produce much more energy with much more intensive solutions. And last, I would say, we're still in search of a forever solution. We can't continue to build renewables, the land it takes up, the minerals it consumes, forever, right? If we think centuries into the future. We can't inject CO2 into the ground forever. So we do need forever solutions. The only one that I know about right now is fusion. The trouble is we don't know if it'll work. But I think the search for forever solutions should occupy climate entrepreneurs. Thanks.
So Chris, before we move on to Kate, I've known you long enough now and heard you speak enough to get momentarily depressed every time that I hear you speak. But I also know that you are fundamentally optimistic. Can you talk a little, and tell me if you're no longer optimistic since we last saw each other, but can you tell me a little bit about why you are optimistic, maybe based on some of the stuff that we've talked about over the past few days? So
I'm certainly optimistic in the US that the policies that have mobilised around this transition is something extraordinary. We haven't addressed all the problems though, so I would say optimistic is something I'm far from. I think we are on a path. I think we can do a lot better. Solar is really surprising us, but at the same time things like clean hydrogen and CCS are perhaps underperforming still. So in the US I have a level of optimism that we have the creative skill, we have the will to make this happen. I was in Pakistan last week. I have to say, when I come from the developing world, I'm much more depressed.
Understandable. So Kate, I know a little bit about the work you've been doing. I again, don't want to put words in your mouth, but I believe that one of the possibilities here, one of the solutions is to actually think about systems and to think about how we can accelerate progress, not just technology by technology or policy by policy, but actually to think about how players work together either within sectors or across sectors to get this done. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff, and it's great to be here this morning. And we just released a series of articles actually looking at exactly this, the cross-sector nature of the challenge of accelerating decarbonization and the energy transition. And there really were two key components that emerged from that series of research articles. And the first is what you see here, which is really to do a bit of a deep dive into some of the sectors that are very much interrelated and interdependent as we think about progress on the transition. So you'll see here that we have industrial manufacturing, critical minerals and mining, the power and utility sector and grid transformation, and then also looking at the existing infrastructure and the built environment, all of which are in process at this point of decarbonization in certain areas, certain ways, at different paces. And all of this, of course, is taking place against the background of stewardship of remaining resources, water, land, looking at waste as an input in terms of waste to energy ideas. So all of this is moving together, but our point here is that we could actually think about sequencing some of the changes, some of the financing innovations, some of the policy levers that actually mark progress across these. And I'll give just a couple of examples, Jeff. One is if we look at what's happened since the passage of the IRA, right? We've seen $227 billion now announced in terms of projects towards clean tech, and that's public and private. We've seen a 50% increase in investments in energy storage. So tremendous reaction, right? We've seen basically manufacturing for clean tech expanding fourfold in the US over the past 5 years, and that even predates the passage of some of this legislation. And yet we still find ourselves watching the growing demand for critical minerals, 200% for lithium, 40% for nickel, 70% for cobalt. And the US finds itself still import dependent in a number of these areas. And so now we are addressing that. I think there's a lot of discussion now about what's happening with critical mineral supply chains. But that's just an example of how interconnected the industrial manufacturing, the clean tech, the energy storage are with other industries. So let me move on to the next slide. And Jeff, I'll turn to you to kind of take us through this. And let me just give a quick preface, which is to say that the second point, in addition to the systems of systems thinking that we just talked about, is that we really need to move from the world where we are today to the world that we need. And we can think about this in terms of individual decision making and also collaborative decision making. And so, Jeff, take us through the framework here in terms of how we've set up this, this discussion.
Yeah, and I will admit it's probably an overly complicated framework. Kate and I have been working on this. It's hot off the press, and we'd love any sort of feedback and especially ideas for improvement. But some of the ideas actually is rooted. I've got a side gig doing a lot of thinking about how to get large organizations to innovate, to do things differently, and especially to challenge traditional management systems and playbooks in order to do things differently. And that's exactly what we need to do as we try to move through the energy transition and do it in a way where we can both respect traditional businesses and traditional business models and not blow apart economies, but also actually shift to doing something new. And so one of the ways that Kate and I have been thinking about this is to think about the nature of the problem that we're facing. And so if I can walk through this overly complicated chart, we've identified or at least defined 4 different types of problems that we think we need to both consider but also move through. So a type A problem, which you'll see down in the bottom left here, it's probably not, you're probably not able to see the 2 different axes here, but the vertical axis is about just the nature of complexity, the relationship complexity between number of parties that are involved in any one of these different types of challenges or transactions, and then the bottom axis has to do with the distribution of returns, meaning who actually profits from or shares in the rewards from getting something done right. And so what we're calling a type A problem is actually a pretty straightforward type of problem that all of us have experienced in day-to-day lives or in our day-to-day business lives, and that is where we're trying to catalyze individual action. One party says to another party, I think you should do this, I'll pay you for this, will you please do it? You come to good negotiable terms and the deal is done. So that's a reasonably straightforward problem. We have systems in the world that are set up to do that. You move up one step in terms of complexity and distribution of returns. Chris talked before about the chicken and egg problem. This is where you have 2 parties coming together who understand that a solution exists and understands that there is a future world in which they can work together and actually close on that solution, close on that deal, but neither one wants to move first, either because the conditions aren't right or the economics aren't right. They're stuck in traditional ways of thinking about managing down risk, and therefore you get a bit of a stall out. But at some point, one of them moves, or they through a little bit more negotiation, you get to terms, or maybe you do a short-term deal in order to get some progress, and things start to unfold, if you end up getting past that. Actually, one of the things that Chris and I have been doing a lot of work on together recently around clean hydrogen is about the fact that we're not getting past the chicken and egg problems in that space today. And the whole system of clean hydrogen development is a bunch of first mover challenges that we need to be able to get beyond. A type C problem, if you move up the chain here in terms of complexity, is one where you have all sorts of those chicken and egg problems coming together at once, like in the clean hydrogen market. Okay, so you're not just trying to solve one problem. You've got dozens of problems. You've got problems between supply side and demand side. You've got problems between public funding and private funding. You've got problems between supply chain and producers, et cetera. That's when things get really, really complicated. And one can sit back and look at that and say, there's no way we're going to sort out this mess. Where do we start, and how do we actually get it done? And that's a lot of the work that Chris and Kate have been doing. A type D problem, which is what we're facing with the energy transition, is what we're calling a system of systems. So imagine what I just described with type C, multiplied across multiple different systems. Kate named 5 of them before on the previous slide, but that is a really, really messy, gnarly problem. And the issue we've got today, I believe, and I think we believe, with the energy transition is that we focus so much on individual solutions and individual technologies and individual policies, and we aim to get them right, but we don't actually think about how to get them to work together as a system. And the only way we will get anywhere close to our net zero goals by 2050 is if we start to consider the system of systems. So there's 2 ways to do that. And this is where we need improvement on the thinking, so please catch me afterwards or yell it out if you've got improvements. But one is just to address it head on. Do things differently. We framed the two different worlds here. I think Kate talked about it at the beginning. The type A and type B problems are kind of the world we know today. We're working on those. We know how to solve things in that world. But the world we need around type C and type D problems is going to require completely different ways of making decisions, of managing risk, of thinking of financing solutions, et cetera. And so, yes, you can address it head on, and you can try to do things differently, but I know, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows, that it's really, really hard to work beyond traditional playbooks of how you get things done. So the second way you can address this challenge is to just start to break it down. Recognize you've got a system of systems problem with the energy transition, and then break it down into smaller and smaller bite-sized pieces. And if you can take that type D problem and break it into what is probably thousands of type A problems, we will actually make some progress. But someone actually, and we collectively have to think about how those all fit together. So that's the setup there. By the way, this is meant to be an audience participation. I know it's 8:38 in the morning, but any questions or reactions to any of the conversation so far? I'm going to hand it back over to Kate in a moment to talk about some examples and some examples of financing. But who would like to brave the walk to the mic first? It's shocking to me that at a breakfast session where most people in the back, oh, thank you. And we have a spotlight, no less.
Good morning. Thank you for that. Very incredible framework you created here. I think it's very useful. But I was thinking from what Chris just spoke about, the developing world. With your experience, and moving around, and after everything we've seen yesterday and we're going to see today that's happening here in Massachusetts, how do you see the developing world joining in this movement? Because if we fix things here but not there, then there's no point.
Yeah. Chris, I'm going to ask you to address that one first, given your recent travels.
Yeah. So I think the best thing we can do is move ahead of the curve ourselves. So steepen our innovation curve, steepen our progress to show the way, and then we are going to have to help them with financing. I actually do think there is a way to do this. The approach we're taking now, where we expect everybody to move together, I don't think that's going to work. We were having a discussion in the room before. Cost of capital in Pakistan is 23%, right? So if you talk about a capital-intensive transition, they're not going to move very fast. But I think if the US and Europe and Australia and Japan can move more quickly, develop the technologies, develop the systems of systems thinking, then I think we have a chance of being able to pull them along in our wake. But it won't be easy.
I'd like to jump in here as well, because I think there are two critical points that were referenced that from an investment standpoint, and that's the domain that I'm in the private capital domain, right? First and foremost, this idea that you can actually have systems development in some places where there's no system existing today at all, right? So if you think about cellular technology in a lot of places like sub-Saharan Africa and places like that, where suddenly you went from having no landline because they didn't exist in those domains to having cell service, and that became a form of payments. So and that disrupted sort of banking systems. So there is a kind of analog in the third world and in a lot of these developing economies where this systems idea actually could be easier in places like that. So I actually have a lot of optimism if we can get this right. I think the second thing, though, that is really critical, and one of the points I was going to make a little later, is the stability of the environment that you're operating in. And that's everything from regulatory policy to trade policy, tax policies, all those kinds of things, political stability, et cetera, are critical. And I think that's one of the reasons why there has been a higher cost of capital and perhaps reticence to invest in the global south, so to speak, is because of that concern about geopolitical risk and the stability of the environment you're operating in. And I think a lot of countries are actually addressing that, right? They are getting better standards around their policy making and their governments and stability and democracy or whatever other principles you want to apply. But the bottom line is if those two things can come together, I think that actually is the bridge to getting there.
Great, thank you, Lori. Any other questions? Otherwise, Kate, maybe you can take us through some examples of these and back to you. Yeah.
This is great, and it actually leads me nicely into this slide where we've, in order to help kind of illustrate the framework, have put on a few examples. The first one here is kind of a solar example. You also see a biofuels example, but just to illustrate for the type A challenge that Jeff was talking about, that's an individual actor. We're catalyzing that individual to understand the benefits and the costs of taking action, say putting solar panels on their own roof, right? That's something that we've gotten to grips with, right? The second is, let's say there is a contract that needs to take place, right? How did the two people that are in that contract, maybe it's a renewable power purchase agreement, they may need to share some risks there in terms of all the risks that we're finding with new technologies into new markets, some pricing instability in some cases, right? But you can have that bilateral agreement. You could do that through contracts for differences. There are certain ways in which you can understand that two parties are going to contract together and kind of share the risks and rewards. The third example here is one actually I thought about over the weekend, Jeff, because a former colleague and I were speaking, and he is actually trying to put solar on the roofs of a huge community in West Virginia. And the way he's decided to do that is break that type C community problem into a series of type B problems, where he's actually trying to align a potential investor owner for each building in the community that's going to have solar panels on the roof. So then you can take advantage of the tax credits, for example, for those individual buildings. Then that puts, essentially solar on for a large number of folks that will benefit from it in that community. And then a type D example is where we need to begin to see evolution that actually spurs activity, not just across the sector, but even among sectors. An example there, to your point, power sector regulation, right? Ways that we begin to think about how this develops. And so as a lead in to your discussion, which will give us a little bit more detail on the financing side of this, I just wanted to present, again, if we kind of break down financing as one of the four enablers that we talk about across the board. In the research we've done, clearly financing is an enabler to the transition. Workforce is business models, of course, come into play, and technology. So across the work we've done, we've looked at those four enablers, and each of them can be mapped according to the world that we know and the world that we need, right? How each of those enablers can evolve to support this kind of decision-making and this kind of progress. And workforce, I think, is an interesting one, Chris, that you brought up, where we begin to see now that we are in a tight labor market situation. We end up with additional job creation from some of the policies that we're talking about. And in addition, we're facing, at least in manufacturing, an applications gap where there's just not enough people coming in to take the jobs, and a skills gap, whether that's operational or it's digital, and trying to actually create the ecosystem to solve this problem, not just for manufacturing, but the overlap now between engineering, construction, manufacturing, energy, because a lot of similar skills are needed across all those industries right now. And so we're seeing an ecosystem approach between academia, other educational institutions, looking at industry organizations doing training, and companies themselves reaching in and doing more training and using digital tools to do that training. Financing, we could say there's a similar trajectory, and that's what this slide takes us to. So we see for that type A individual action problem, there are bank loans, there are familiar insurance products. These are things that are not mysteries. For the type B, again, sharing of risks, mitigating risk through contracts for differences, long-term offtake contracts. Type C gets a little more complicated, like my friend who's trying to do solar across an entire community. But there again, reliance on some of the new government public funding vehicles, looking at philanthropy stepping in, for example, to provide short-term loans for construction periods until tax credits can be received. And then finally, type D, that may be a larger kind of evolution. For example, if we look at the utility sector, monetizing aggregations of distributed energy resources to bring those onto the grid and begin to think differently about some of these new sources of energy, for example. So unless there are questions or further comments, yeah. Let's. So let me repeat the
and
question
so just to
quickly.
repeat the question is where do
Yeah.
time frame problems fit? I'm just repeating for the rest of the audience who
Yeah.
may not have hit that. So
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm going to turn it over to Lori to answer, but the question was, if we think of this as a time frame problem in terms of if you're a homeowner, your span for making some of these improvements may be 5 years, and how do you actually then align the time frame for the rewards and also for the costs in something like that? Even if you are an individual actor, you still have that challenge. So,
Yeah, and
over to you.
actually I was going to make a couple of points, but I'll start with this one. Certainly from a private capital investor standpoint, you always think about things in terms of long-term payoffs versus short-term payoffs, right? And there are different ways to sort of frame the problem. One is, you know, you're going to have a very large outlay if you're going to put solar panels on your roof, for example, and you don't really know necessarily what that payoff's going to be. You can do studies to say, well, geez, I think we're going to save $100 a month in terms of my energy bills, but as you note, if you're going to leave in 5 years, well, that may not be a long enough time frame. But what's interesting is that the more you can get transparency around what all the different drivers are of value creation, the more you can actually justify things even if the sort of immediacy of that payoff don't exist. So for example, a lot of people will do kitchen renovations. We know that kitchen renovations generate about 75% of the cost that you spend in an uptick in terms of the cost that you, or the price that you actually realize on the property. So there is a kind of terminal value that you can factor into these investments as well. So ultimately, it still does become an economic proposition, but thinking about it from short-term versus long-term, if you can get some assignment of terminal value, then that can actually make that still relevant for you and make it actually pay off even if you're not going to stay in the house. But I want to sort of expand just briefly on this kind of broader idea that as investors, part of the trick here is to understand where all of this innovation and all this activity fits into the broader strategic framework for the company. So for example, if you look at a company like Google or Alphabet, one of the things that they are doing is really thinking about how to monetize information that they have in this space to do things like enable homeowners to think about whether they should put solar panels on their roof and whether there are enough sunny days to actually justify that and whether they're going to get a payoff from that. That's a brand new business line for them. So when we think about how to support companies that are involved in climate transition and the technologies that underpin that, changes in behaviors of consumers, because in some sense you would say that one of the ways that Alphabet is participating is by changing the incentives and changing the behaviors, which is equally important to a lot of the other kinds of things that we're talking about here. This idea of shifting from short to long-term modality and having better transparency to what those payoffs might look like because they're so integrated into corporate strategy is something that's really, really critical to catalyze that private capital. The other two, just very briefly, that I was going to mention is, and this sort of came up a little bit in one of the questions earlier, is this idea of what are the sort of frameworks under which we're all operating, whether that's the regulatory landscape, whether that's the availability of raw materials and not having sanctions in place that are going to disrupt supply chains of critical inputs to the process, whether that's tax policy. Again, the more stability you can have around the operating environment that you're going to have over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, the better off you're going to be. And then the final point is this idea of disclosure and companies sort of having a level playing field about what they're actually telling investors, what they're required to tell investors from a disclosure basis. And increasingly, that's not just about how do we get our heads around the economics of the transaction in terms of how that's going to get funded and how the payoffs are going to materialize over time and what the metrics are to actually judge the efficacy and the value of the project, but more and more capital is seeking double materiality, right? They're looking for not just financial outcomes, but real world outcomes in the space as well. So the disclosure to be able to evidence those real world outcomes is also critically important.
So Lori, and this is, by the way, the warm call to all of you that we have this mic perfectly set up for questions in the middle of the room. So don't make it feel
But this has
lonely.
great acoustics. We're in the House of Blues. We can hear you.
Exactly. No, we are. I am going to ask for some audience questions in a moment. But Lori, it's the slide that's still up here that Kate presented. The interesting thing I think about the Type C and Type D financing solutions is they don't exist, and something has to evolve for us to get there, or a philanthropist shows up and decides to fund it out of her own good heart. How is the financial sector, and maybe State Street, if you want to comment specifically on State Street, how is the financial sector evolving to break what is sometimes seen as the chicken and egg problem between finance and tech? Because a lot would say, and I'm not saying the majority would say, but some would say, that finance is the challenge right now because they're just not shifting the way that you think about managing risk.
Well, first of all, I would say that we do have templates for this, right? We have public-private partnership schemes. We have supranational agencies that make loans. We have lots of incentives. I mean, you think about the IRA or the European, New Green Deal. You've got lots of capital that's available. And I think one of the tricks is, again, going back to my earlier comment, is how do you know that that's going to have a stable environment and that those incentives are going to be aligned against what is probably ultimately private financing, right? You need kind of escape velocity for some of these technologies, and oftentimes there are multiple ways that governments and private investors can kind of work together, whether that's in being sort of a beta test. I mean, we had dinner last night. Some of you may have been at the event last evening over at the JFK Library. The sort of moonshot idea. That wasn't just private, it wasn't just public, it was a coming together. So those mechanisms become catalysts and provide the capital, especially in early stage unproven technologies. But I want to go back to the point that Chris made earlier. We have a lot of technologies today that are actually viable, that in their own right investors are quite drawn to. So again, being able to have the disclosure, the transparency, the commitment, the strategic imperative, those things ultimately will draw capital into the mix as well.
Great, thank you. We're getting ready for those questions. I'm going to set you all up with what may be the final question of the panel as we wait for people to wander up to the mic here. But where I will go in a moment is to ask each of you, if you think about the entire system or system of systems that we're dealing with here, something has to happen first or next. What would you think that thing should be? And I'll give you a moment to think about it as we hear some questions. And by the way, we got a very helpful note here that the only way that the stream hears the questions is if you do come up to the mic, so please do so. Please, yeah.
Sure. You mentioned that you want to see systems of systems, and that's a little hard for me to imagine what you mean. Could you describe it? Maybe a hypothetical perfect system or a good system?
So Kate, maybe I'll turn this to you. If you could just, in the road to scale work that you've been doing, you've described 5 different areas that need to work in concert in order for us to accelerate decarbonization, energy transition. Can you just name what those are? And what we mean, what I mean when I say system of systems is all these things working together to accomplish a common goal, which ultimately is to impact climate change.
Right. No, thank you for that question. And I think if we go back to the enablers, right, we talked about financing, we talked about workforce, we talked about business models, we talked about technology. So if we think about industrial manufacturing for a moment, in order to really move the needle for industrial manufacturing, all of those enablers need to be in place. And if we go back to the workforce example, we're seeing right now the creation of a system around workforce, right, that is academic institutions, it's community colleges, it's training being done by industry associations, it's high school apprenticeships, for example, internships, things like this, that are really beginning to pull people from new pools of talent, bring them into new training programs, skill them up with new technologies and new skills, digital and operational and otherwise. Teach them also basic skills, what we call soft skills, that are becoming more and more important in terms of critical thinking, for example. So that whole system of workforce training, attraction, retention, compensation needs to be in place. And then if we look at the larger progress within industrial manufacturing, and you could say the same in terms of technologies, right? You could say the same in terms of forging a supply chain for new critical minerals, for example, or other components that need to be involved in the rise in clean tech manufacturing. So business models, right? We've seen auto OEMs reaching in to do bilateral contracts with suppliers of copper or nickel in order to get ahead of the growing demand for those elements, right? And so in a lot of ways, there's innovation happening within industrial manufacturing, but it's part of a system of systems in terms of everybody involved in workforce preparation and retention, everybody involved in forging new supply chains. So when I think of system of systems, you need to think broadly about all of the elements that come together to move us forward on the path. I hope that helps give an example.
And it really, I mean, every single one of the systems you just named is a really, really complicated thing that people spend their lives trying to solve or bring together. And so I think really what we're trying to encourage is to take that small aperture that any one of us may have on the thing that matters most to us in our lives and try to consider the broader set of considerations and how, for example, the education system impacts technology or any one of the other things that Kate has named. Please.
Hi, good morning. Alistair Pym from NECC, the Northeast Clean Energy Council. I love the whole system of systems thinking, and I think that's exactly what we need, but I think it needs a bit of orchestration. So back in the day, Jeremy Rifkin, who wrote The Third Industrial Revolution, encouraged Europe to do some regional master planning. And I was lucky enough to be at one of those events where they kicked it off in the north part of France back in 2010. So in Europe, that seems to work, but in the US, they don't talk a lot about master planning. But first of all, do you think it needs orchestration? Do you think master planning is the right way to do that? And who should be the orchestrator in the US? Should it be the federal government, the state government? All those questions.
Chris, can you comment on that?
I'm glad you made this comment because for my final remark, I was going to say the two things missing in my mind are coordination, so master planning plus implementation, and regulation. And I think you've really hit on it. The country that is moving fastest right now is China. And it's not a society we all would want to live in, but they have a really strong master planning focus and a very strong hands-on coordination focus. I think this is crucial. Systems of systems can evolve, but we need a revolution, not evolution right now. 2050 is around the corner. So I think master planning and coordination are crucial.
Federal, state, or local?
You know, I think it's going to take a bit of all.
Yeah.
Federal government setting the kind of guidelines, state governments implementing, and then even local governments having a role in this. I don't think you can do it independently.
A good landing place for climate tech here in Boston. I think we have time for one more question.
Sorry, just testing it out. All right. So you can let me know if I'm wrong on any of this, but my understanding is that about 2/3 of the U.S. energy market is deregulated. So I think 15 years ago we were saying the issue with solar is it's too expensive, but now it's very, very cheap. Has that become an issue? Because if you're looking at investing in a solar farm as a bank, you might say, well, you operate in a deregulated market where basically that means you can't tell what the price will be tomorrow, let alone in 5 years as the tech gets better and better. And if that is a problem, are there market solutions, or would there be a hope that government steps in and sets a base price or removes subsidies in some area? How do you tackle that?
Lori, do you want to address that?
Yeah, maybe I'll just take that. So I guess the first point that I would make is I don't think that you need to have a regulated market to have transparency about pricing, right? In fact, the vast majority of capitalism is built on the idea that you have, market clearing pricing, and so as long as the margin, if you will, on that investment is attractive, it's still very attractive from a private capital standpoint. So I don't think being regulated, in fact, for years, utilities languished as an investment sort of sector in part because there was this view that you really didn't have a lot of, upside potential because it was a regulated market. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would say is that the demand for energy in this country remains insatiable, and things like AI and other technologies that we're not talking about here at this conference are going to only increase the demand for that energy. And so we need any and all, if you will, to be able to fulfill that demand. And then the third is that we have sort of reached that tipping point where the cost of production for many of these technologies, including solar, are actually lower than the cost of production for traditional fossil fuels. So they're, again, per energy generation unit. So there are some advantages, even if the price, quote unquote, is not necessarily as as buoyant.
All right, we are rapidly approaching time. Chris commented on what needs to happen next. Unless you want to say anything else, Kate, what was your what's next comment?
Well, I think I covered it in terms of ensuring some of the coordination we were talking about among some of these systems, right? And it starts in very granular levels, but I think it's cumulative.
Lori?
You know, this is sort of table stakes. So at some point, we need a price of carbon, like a true price of carbon, because then you can do all these trade-offs with actual, figures instead of speculation.
Great. Thank you. I'm glad to see the audience is filled out for our next guest. Thank you all for your participation, and please do let us know what you think of some of the ideas.
Thank you.